One thing I've learned is this: in politics and in combat, cowardice is contagious, but so is courage. And if you're willing to be the first person over those ramparts, you will be shocked at how many people will come with you. I'm asking you to come with me. I'm asking you to be a part of the generation that will restore the promise of this country and breathe new life into it.
Hi, this is Nick Freitas with Making the Argument, and today we have a very special guest. We're going to be talking to Erich Pratt from Gun Owners of America. Now, as the name applies, this is a group that really is just intent on defending our Second Amendment rights. They see it as an essential civil liberty. I have worked with them in the Virginia House of Delegates. We are thrilled to have their endorsement for our congressional run, and it means all the more to me because there's a lot of good gun groups out there. There's a lot of groups out there that fight hard for our civil liberties, but Gun Owners of America is one of those groups that is just uncompromising when it comes to the defense of our Second Amendment rights. They truly recognize the value and the purpose of it as the way the founders intended. They don't see the Second Amendment as your right to hunt or gun collect. They see it as essential to preserving human liberty and for your right to be able to defend yourself. And they don't just fight on that issue. That is one of their main focuses, but I have seen them fight for liberty across the board. And so we are just very, very thrilled to have Erich Pratt here from Gun Owners of America. Erich, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Nick, thank you for that. And it's just an honor to be on here with you. So just look forward to this. Look forward to all that you've been doing, that you've accomplished in the House of Delegates. And certainly while we're sad to lose you in the state of Virginia, we're looking forward to having you in Congress.
Well, thank you very much. It'll definitely be an interesting world up there. But again, it's a big comfort to know that you guys who have always been there in the General Assembly are also up in D.C. helping to preserve our rights there as well. Can you give everyone a background a little bit on how Gun Owners of America was started, and what do you guys see as some of the key functions that you play in the defense of liberty and the defense of the Second Amendment?
Sure. Well, we were started in 1976, and I think a word that you said earlier really addresses what we're all about, and that's the word uncompromising. We really felt that we needed to defend the right to keep and bear arms, as the Second Amendment says, without any infringements, not supporting infringements. And so, for example, we were the first organization, national organization at the federal level, to support constitutional carry. Back then, back in the 90s, it was called Vermont carry, you might remember. But the whole idea of constitutional carry, where good people can carry firearms without getting permission from the government, just like you don't get permission to preach a sermon or print an editorial. In the same way, our Second Amendment protected rights shouldn't be subject to permission either. And that was kind of high octane for some people, even in the gun community. But nevertheless, we were out there in front pushing for this, and now we have it in 17 states. I think that's one of the things that we've seen. Just taking a no compromise stand has made a real difference. The New York Times credited GOA with killing Obama's gun control in 2013. And it was just by rallying the troops and saying, we're not going to sign off on universal background checks or any of these other compromises. We're just going to say, we're not going to accept any of it, and we will hold you accountable if you vote for it. A few years later, we defeated some Harry Reid gun control. He was really upset. He held a press conference and said that his direct quote, GOA is worse than bad. It's kind of a badge of honor. I don't know how bad is, but we are worse than bad. So that's the thing that we hear. And, you're going to Congress, Lord willing. The thing that we hear a lot in Congress is that our members are very loud and very active. And that's how we've been able to win a lot of battles over the 40 years that we've been around.
Well, and I think it's important, too, when you look at these issues like constitutional carry, because I've carried constitutional carry legislation in Virginia, and it was fascinating to see some of the Democrat opposition to it and the nature of that opposition. I remember one delegate, because I was pointing out, I said, look, all constitutional carry is to say that in Virginia, if you want to open carry, your constitutionally protected right, you can do that. I can walk into a store right now with a gun on my hip, provided that I'm a law-abiding citizen and there's no problems. I said, but the moment that I want to carry discreetly, or the moment my wife wants to carry discreetly, and instead of carrying it on her hip, she wants to put it in her purse or she wants to put her shirt over it. Now, all of a sudden, she's committed a crime unless she gets special permission from the government. And it was fascinating to watch Delegate Dan Helmer, who is a huge anti-gun guy in Virginia. Dan Helmer come and said, well, maybe we need tests before you can actually carry the gun, open carry as well. Would you like us to do that? And I remember thinking to myself, I remember a time not so long ago when the Democratic Party were big fans of making you pass a test before you can exercise your essential civil liberties. They did it all over the Jim Crow South, where you had to take a poll test where they would ask ridiculous questions specifically to be able to disenfranchise black voters. And now here they're talking about coming up with some sort of arbitrary test that the government would apply to determine whether or not you're worthy of exercising your Second Amendment rights. And it just struck me that, it's as if some people just never learn. When you give the government this kind of arbitrary power, what ends up happening? I mean, they think that this will keep guns out of the hands of bad guys. No, what happened when we had those gun control laws in the Jim Crow South was that the Ku Klux Klan member could get a gun, but Martin Luther King got denied a concealed carry permit because it was not a shall issue state at that point, and they allowed corrupt government officials to pick and choose who got to exercise their essential civil liberties. So I really appreciate the fact, because a lot of times anymore in today's, when you say uncompromising, people automatically think that that's a bad thing. Like, no, when we're talking about the truth, when we're talking about your rights, when we're talking about your ability to defend yourself, taking an uncompromising position that we want those rights equally applied to all Americans, that's the correct position to take. And I appreciate your guys' boldness on this. But you guys have done this, not just for the Second Amendment. You guys have been doing this on some other issues as well lately with COVID-19. Can you talk a little bit about some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Nancy Pelosi has tried to use COVID-19 legislation as her avenue to get all kinds of things, put in, things that are really just, a whole grab bag of things that liberals would like to see passed, including gun control, things like mail-in ballots, red flag laws. These are all things that Nancy Pelosi has tried to get put into these COVID-19 relief bills. And quite frankly, we've seen, you know how this is done, Nick, given the fact that you've been in the legislature, how legislators will use a must-pass bill to get all these ancillary type things thrown in. And that's exactly what anti-Democrats have been trying to do. With mail-in ballots, just real briefly, that's one of the biggest avenues to fraud that there is. Thankfully, most states don't have that. We're not talking about like absentee balloting. We're talking about a system where everybody is mailed a ballot, and it's just ripe for fraud and abuse. We've seen that in places that have done it. I don't share much agreement with former President Jimmy Carter, but in this one area, he was part of a bipartisan commission studying this, and he said the greatest avenue for fraud is mail-in ballots, and he's absolutely right. And it invariably always helps Democrats wherever you see mail-in ballots. The other thing that Nancy Pelosi wanted to put in was red flag laws. And of course, with red flag laws, and Nick, you know this, you were fighting this on the floor of Virginia legislature, but it allows a person's guns to be taken away from them simply because of an accusation. No trial, no jury, no due process, just a false accusation, and your guns can be taken away. Just like that, with no due process, almost 20 states now have red flag laws, and already there's been horrific abuses as guns have been taken from innocent people, and in some cases they've been murdered in the process. So what GOA did is, with this legislation, this must-pass legislation, in the midst of this pandemic, we rallied the troops, and that's what we do. We help activate people. We help empower people. We generated over 1 million responses into Republican offices in the Senate, and it has a huge impact when they're hearing from the grassroots. And so, we were able to kill this. We obviously, as a gun group, didn't take a position on the COVID-19 relief bill itself, but we were successful in stopping all these other things from being thrown into it.
Well, and you're right. This sort of advocacy, because I'll be honest, and I'll vent here a little bit, because I had somebody that I know who's never really been that involved in politics before, send me an email, or it was a Facebook message, I think, just talking about how, you guys aren't doing anything and we elected you to fight this and what are you doing? And I responded back, I'm like, are you kidding me right now? Like, we have been fighting incredibly hard for this. I've been working with organizations like Gun Owners of America, like VCDL, like National Association of Gun Rights. And one of the things that's been so frustrating, I know you've experienced this, Phil Van Cleef has experienced this, and others, when the Democrats took control of the General Assembly in Virginia for the first time in 26 years and just ran as far to the left as they possibly could. And they were talking about, after years of hearing from Democrats, nobody wants to take your guns. The moment they took power, it was gun confiscation time. It was, we're going to throw you in jail for having a magazine that carries over 12 rounds. It was just a litany of absurd legislation. And we rallied, we got people down there. We had the 2A sanctuary movement. It was incredible. It was incredible to watch everybody showing up. But I could not believe the number of people that were willing to show up on a cold Thursday night in order to protest in favor of their gun rights, who were not registered to vote or who hadn't voted in the last election. And now some of them are saying, well, what are we going to do about this? And my attitude at this point, I'm going to be honest, because I know I've given a lot to this fight. You've given a lot to this fight, and we're both going to continue to give a lot to it. But before, if you're one of those people that are watching this, listening to this, and you're concerned about your rights, before you demand something more of another person, ask yourself, what have you demanded from yourself? Because Eric's absolutely right. If you want to know why some of the worst legislation in Virginia last year got pushed to the side, it got pushed to next year. We didn't kill it outright. We weren't able to. We didn't have the votes. But the reason why it didn't pass this year was because Gun Owners of America and other groups like that rallied tens of thousands of people to be able to show up, have their voices heard, talk to those legislators that were a little bit wishy-washy on these issues. And that's what did it. So, one thing, and I want to hit this a couple times throughout because I want people to know that it's a big part of its elections. Some of it is challenging things in the courts, and we're on board for all of it, right? We will use all the methods that we have within our capacity to be able to defend liberties, to be able to defend your Second Amendment rights. Talk a little bit about, you guys do great work in the legislature. You do great work on supporting candidates that are pro-Second Amendment. But as we saw in Virginia, sometimes we don't have the votes. Those bills get passed. They get signed into law by a governor like Ralph Northam. And now the next step is the courts. And you guys fight on that front as well. Tell us a little bit about the work that you've done in the courtroom fighting against these unconstitutional infringements on Second Amendments.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've been very involved, in fact, all across the country, because we've been seeing everywhere, governors and even at the local level, they've been closing down gun stores, closing down gun ranges. And we've actually been very successful in the courts. We fought in Massachusetts. We were able to get the governor to open up gun stores and gun ranges. In Maryland, they had gun stores open, but not gun ranges. So we sent a letter to the governor, and right after that, we explained the law and how he was out of accord with the law. He got that fixed immediately. Same thing in North Carolina. We had to go into several localities to get them to overturn their closures of gun stores. Here in Virginia, of course, we took a case because gun ranges were shut down all across the state. So we took a case in Lynchburg where us and VCDL together represented a gun range that was there. And initially, the governor tried. In fact, it's interesting because he was not only was he violating the emergency powers in Virginia, which does not allow him to suspend people's right to keep and bear arms, but the governor's executive order allowing for the gun ranges to be shut down violated the very Emergency Powers Act that he voted for when he was in the legislature. So, nothing short of hypocritical, not to mention he's violating the U.S. and Virginia constitutions. But anyway, we sued the governor. Immediately, his team tried to bump that case out of state court into federal court because they knew the federal court that covers this area is very liberal, and they would have a much better chance. It was interesting, though, we presented a strong federalism argument, and even though it was a Clinton-appointed judge, he agreed with us and said, this isn't for the federal courts, send it back down to Virginia. Well, we could see why the governor wanted to bump it out of Virginia, because not only did he lose the attempt to take it out of the state, but then once we were actually able to try the case in the Lynchburg, in the courts there around Lynchburg, we were able to win that case as well. So the long and the short of it is, in the next emergency order, and of course, that's a whole problem right there, right? Governors issuing legislation without the legislature. But in his next emergency order, he listed gun ranges as essential. And so they became open throughout the whole, well, lived in Virginia, because then Northern Virginia clamped down and said, no, we're still going to be under lockdown. But in the rest of the state, gun ranges were open. So, being involved in the courts can make a huge difference. Although, I always like to warn people, while it's important to be involved there, Nick, what you're doing is so important. And I just, want to really reiterate that for people who are listening, because what you're doing in running for the legislature, I mean, first of all, constitutionally, according to the Supremacy Clause, it's, among other things, the Constitution and laws passed by the Congress pursuant to the Constitution that are the supreme law of the land. Nowhere in the Supremacy Clause are Supreme Court opinions mentioned. So, what you're doing is actually at the core of what governs us. It's the courts have a role, but they don't issue supreme law. The Constitution and constitutional laws do that. But then there's the pragmatic part of this. The congressmen, we can actually hold accountable. We can hire and fire them, every 2 years or every 6 years. You can't do that with judges. Yeah. They're there for life. A lot of them disregard the Constitution. And so, I mean, let's be honest, it's very frustrating with a lot of the cases that we bring. The judges just simply disregard the Constitution. They disregard the Second Amendment. In a sense, it's kind of a crapshoot. In some of the times when we're taking cases. I mean, I'm very grateful that in these past few months we've been very successful, as I just mentioned, in Massachusetts and here in Virginia and some other places as well. The courts have ruled in our favor, but it's not always like that. And so you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to bring these court cases. I'll tell you what, it's a lot easier just to kill bad legislation before it passes. And that's why we need good congressmen like Nick Freitas.
Well, no, thank you. I appreciate that. And no, I think and that's correct. It's again, another one of these questions that I get a lot is, again, what are you doing? And I do feel like in some senses we've failed people on civics with respect to what the legislature does, what the executive does, what the judiciary does. And the judiciary, again, you won't find anywhere in the Constitution where it says that the Supreme Court gets to arbitrarily decide what's constitutional and what isn't, right? That was kind of established in Marbury versus Madison with judicial review and things like that. And I get it. We've kind of gone along like that. But every level of government, no matter where you're serving at, you swear an oath to the Constitution. You have an obligation to ensure that before you do something, before you recommend something, you're actually referencing the Constitution and you're referencing it in a way that is intellectually honest in order to determine whether or not your piece of legislation actually comports with the Constitution. Because I can tell you right now, we have so many legislators that their attitude is, I'm going to do whatever I want, and then the courts will decide whether or not it's constitutional, which is why they're so, hard and fast to get their liberal judges on the courts. And look, Technically, it shouldn't matter. Liberal judge, conservative judge, it shouldn't matter, provided that you're following an originalist interpretation of the Constitution, which is nothing more than, interpret the Constitution with the text that was used in the context in which it was used and in a reasonable fashion. That's it. And if you don't like what the Constitution says, well, there's a process for amending it. But more and more I see out of our left-wing colleagues where it's, no, they're gonna try to go as hard and as fast as they can. They're going to try to tie you up in court. They're going to try to drain you of finances until they either intimidate you into what they want, or they actually get a judge to make a really bad ruling. And with a lot of these legal positivist judges, they can get that. And so, the legislative component is so important. One of the things I try to do with my constituents too is I try to plug them in. I try to give them tips on what's the best way to lobby. And then I tell them which organizations I trust, again, like Gun Owners of America, to actually use, because not everyone has time to be a full-time, they don't have time to be an elected official. They don't have time to be fully engaged in politics. They don't have time to be a lobbyist, but they want to do something with their time, talents, and treasure to be able to defend the things that they care about. One of the things I tell them is like, look, if you don't got much time to interact with your representatives, here's what you do. Rather than send out a form email to 100 delegates or a form email to 400 plus congresspeople, find out which committee is the bill going to, and focus your efforts on those members of that committee, because they're the ones that are going to have the first look at this thing. And you can really maximize your effectiveness by focusing on those legislators in that respective committee and letting them know that you're watching and that you're concerned about this. Because most people were shocked to find out when I tell them that 70% of the legislation in Virginia dies in subcommittee or full committee. 70 to 80%. By the time it gets to the floor of the House of Delegates, when they're watching the TV and they're seeing the floor debate, 95% of those bills pass at that point, because it's almost already been decided, and we're doing our best at the last minute to make good arguments and to try to beat it. But again, it's 95% chance it's gonna pass the House if it makes it all the way to the floor. What are some of the recommendations you would give people that are interested in joining Gun Owners of America, donating to Gun Owners of America? How can they maximize the time that they have or the resources that they have to be effective advocates for the Second Amendment and for our Constitution?
Absolutely. What we try to do is make it easy for people to be effective. And I think you addressed this. People don't have the time, with their families and with their jobs and all the other things that they're doing. They can't be, here in Washington or in Richmond researching all the bills, trying to decide which bills, do have the best chance of making it through, and, following the whole A to Z through the committee process on the floor. But see, that's the thing, that's the type of research that we do. And one of the things at Gun Owners of America that we're committed to doing is not alerting people to every single bill that is introduced, every single bad bill. There's a lot of bad bills. And there are some that like doing that, kind of the Chicken Little, the sky is falling. Oh, look at this bad bill and this bad bill. We try to identify those bills that actually have a chance of moving and that are moving, and focus people's attention on that. Because for one thing, we don't want to wear people out. So we want to lead them to where the fight actually is. And it's in doing that, I tell people all the time, you could do this on your own, and you could send your own letter. And, honestly, it'll be like a drop in the ocean. There's very little ripple effect. But when there's an organization that is guiding, masses of people to put heat on their legislators, that does make a difference. Last year in August, there were 3 mass killings, one right after another. And you may remember, there was a lot of talk, bring Congress back, because it happened during the August recess, bring Congress back, demand a vote on gun control right away. And we were in communication with pro-gun offices, Republican offices up on Capitol Hill, and they said, hey, guys, we are under a lot of pressure here. We saw, even at the White House, they were feeling the pressure. And so we immediately, started putting out alerts, generating action into the Congress and into the White House. When all was said and done, we generated over 3 million responses into Republican offices and into the White House. And I won't say who it is, but a high-level congressional office told us, said, if it wasn't for you guys, gun control would have already passed, because the media pressure was so intense. But they said you provided the counter pressure that really stiffened a lot of spines around here. And so nothing passed. Yeah. Because they were talking about red flag laws and all kinds of other things. Nothing passed. And so that's really what makes the difference. And so, people can, if they go to gunowners.org, our email alerts are free. Just sign up for the email alerts. And so we try to keep them low volume, but when things are moving, that's when we generate action, put a lot of heat. There was he's deceased now, but the late Senator Everett Dirksen used to say, "When I feel the heat, I see the light." And that's kind of our unofficial motto, and thankfully that there's guys like you, Nick, who I know are principled, and you're always, guided by what the Constitution says. A lot of others, as you know, because you've worked with them, that's not what guides them. It's not principle, at least not constitutional principle. It's the principle of getting reelected. Yeah. And so, it's sticking their finger in the wind. And if all they're hearing is from the media, then we know where that's going to take us. It's going to take us to more gun control. So we try to connect legislators' base with them to say, hey, there's a lot of us out here that you're not hearing from. We don't want gun control.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a great point, because one of the most frustrating moments of my time in the General Assembly, and it was actually on a different bill, it had to do with Obamacare expansion, but I heard another Republican say, well, look, the people want this now. And I looked at him, and it was amazing to me, because it was this idea that your job as a representative is to go look at whatever poll CNN puts out and then decide where you stand on an issue. I'm like, well, no, my job is not to stick my finger up in the air. It's not to read a poll. My job is to be open and honest with my constituents, with my voters, about what I believe, the processes I use, my fealty to the Constitution. I should be honest with them, honest, open, transparent about what I believe and why I believe it. And then when I go down to Richmond, that's supposed to be my guide, because that's what they elected me to do, right? If I was honest with them about what I believe and they elected me, it's because they felt that my values, my thought process represented them. But I see too many legislators that they don't go down to, they don't go into the legislature with any sort of like overriding guiding principle. It's this just popularity contest. And if they start to, and again, the problem with it is that's not the way it should be. But the reality is that it is the way it is for a lot of people. And so the more active that you can be with an organization that is going to help you focus your attention and your efforts to maximum effect, it does have a difference. If Gun Owners of America, VCDL, these other groups, if they had not done what they did during this last legislative session, as bad as it got, it would have been 10 times worse. I mean, we would have been looking at a very real situation where law enforcement would have been showing up to your door to confiscate your firearms. I was trying to explain on the floor, and I remember strategizing with you on this before I engaged in the floor debate. I said, all right, if each magazine that you have that goes above 12 rounds, at first it was a felony, then they tried to get it passed by dropping it down to a misdemeanor, and I made him explain on the floor, like, okay, how long can I spend in jail for a class 1 misdemeanor? And they didn't want to answer the question. I said, okay, well, I'll answer it for you. It's 12 months. I said, not only that, it's not 12 months it's 12 months for every offense. So now if I have a couple handguns in the house and I'm perfectly responsible and everything else, but those handguns each came with a few magazines, that's 6 years in jail for having a magazine that carries more than 12 rounds. That's your idea. At the same time that you on the other side of the aisle are talking about we're locking too many people up, you now want to lock up responsible people. So again, I would just say to everyone listening to this, this is a serious issue. And I just had another experience a couple days ago where I talked about the importance of the Second Amendment and how many on the left are coming after our Second Amendment rights. And sure enough, someone from the left shows up and this is ridiculous. Nobody wants your guns. I don't know if that's just rank ignorance, or they have just gotten to a point where they are so dishonest about what they actually want to do that they're willing to blatantly and openly lie about it. But I'm going to tell you right now, if you contact my office asking me what I'm doing about it, I'm going to tell you, but then I'm going to ask you what you're doing about it. Because we had a saying in the military, you can delegate authority, but you can't delegate responsibility. And so, yes, when you elect someone to represent you, you are delegating the authority to go down and vote on your behalf. But we all have a responsibility to defend our rights, to find the best ways that we can use our time, our talents, our treasure to be able to defend the rights that we appreciate, defend the sort of rights that we want our kids to inherit, and quite frankly, defend the rights that hundreds of thousands of Americans died fighting to protect and defend. And we have an obligation to do that. So, Erich, one more time, I want you to talk about your website, talk about Gun Owners of America. How can people get involved? Because that's what I want them to do. You guys do an outstanding job of ensuring that whatever time, whatever treasure they can donate, you use it to maximum effect. And I want more people to understand how they can get involved with Gun Owners of America. How should they do that to the people that are listening and watching?
Absolutely. Gunowners.org is the best way to get a hold of us and to sign up, not only for membership, but I really emphasize get on that email list so that you're getting the latest information, not only at the federal level, but at the state level as well. And, we try to make it easy for people. We give them pre-written letters that they can use. One of the things, Nick, we found is that if you give somebody a pre-written letter, it actually generates more personalized letters rather than just saying, hey, here's an issue, do something about it. If we give them language, people actually use it to craft their own. So we actually generate some people will send the pre-written letter, and that's fine too, because that says, hey, I'm a voter in your district. Hopefully you're a voter in the district. If not, you need to, and I appreciate what you were saying earlier about that, Nick. People need to register, make sure their adult children are registered as well. I mean, this is a very important time where we need to be taking this seriously. But sending that letter and says, hey, I'm in your district and I really care about this issue. If you want to take the time and make it into a personalized letter, all the better. But that's how we generated 3 million messages last August and killed gun control. It wasn't by asking people to sit down at their computers and draft their own letters. We might have gotten, 10,000 or something if you just do it that way. But if you give the people the pre-written language, then they'll take it and run with it. And by the way, just one of the things as you were talking about debate on the floor, it was entertaining, Nick, to see you taking on Delegate Mark Levine. You were absolutely right. He didn't want to answer your questions. He was so uncomfortable. You're a fantastic debater. I'd hate to be, even if I knew I was right, have to be on the other side of you. You do a good job with that. But I tell you what, you were a force to be reckoned with in Richmond. That's why I say, we're going to miss you down here in Richmond, but I really look forward to having your leadership, because I really think boldness breeds boldness. Mm-hmm. And you are a bold, forceful advocate, not just for the Second Amendment, but many other constitutional issues as well, that, personally, I appreciate and I agree with. But on the Second Amendment issue, you're a bold warrior, and that's going to energize other people who are, maybe not so bold. Maybe have some of the at least we're elected saying the right things, but then they get into office and they start drifting, they start putting their finger up in the wind. So it's good to have people like you that can help strengthen their resolve. So anyway, you're one of the races that we are hugely supporting and involved in. In fact, I should say, I don't know if you saw, but Bloomberg's Everytown just came out with their ratings and who they're going to be giving money to this week. And your opponent, Abigail Spanberger, is one of the few chosen ones that Bloomberg is going to be supporting big time. And so what that says to anybody who is in your district, we're talking all this stuff about, lobbying your legislator, making them hear your voice. she's one person who will not listen to your voice on this issue because she wants to continue feeding at the Bloomberg trough, getting his money and his support. So if you really care about the Second Amendment issue, it is really important to make sure that Abigail can spend a lot more time with her family after this November.
Well, again, Erich, thank you so much for everything that you do, for everything that Gun Owners of America does. Again, it's just really appreciate you taking the time and definitely look forward to continuing to work with you in the future.
Absolutely. Likewise, look forward to it, Nick.
Thank you very much. Well, that is all the time we have today on Making the Argument. I just want to leave you with one more point before we close out here. You've heard a lot of great information from Erich. It's a wonderful organization. I really encourage you to look it up. The reason why, and I get asked sometimes, why do you spend so much time on the Second Amendment? You know, and it's the usual. Sometimes it's this accusatory, are you a gun nut, or you this, or you that. This is about people. This is about having gone all over the world, having fought in wars, having seen what happens when the government takes away the ability for a law-abiding, freedom-loving citizen to be able to defend themselves, to be able to defend the family, to be able to defend their country. I watched as communities in Iraq were torn apart because they were not permitted to have firearms. And so when criminal organizations came in, when terrorist organizations came in, they were completely left at the mercy of them. And so this really comes down to an issue of, do you have a fundamental right to be able to defend yourself? And the answer for me is yes, it's absolutely. And one of the things that a firearm does, and I have reiterated this so many times because I need people to understand where I'm coming from, a firearm is an equalizer. I'm a Green Beret. I was taught how to fight in all kinds of different ways. And if I meet you in a dark alley and you try to mug me, chances are I'm going to be able to defend myself. But I can't say the same for my wife. I can't say the same for my young daughters. And the idea that they would be forced by their own government to be at the mercy of an attacker that was stronger than them, could overpower them at multiple attackers, and that you would take away the one instrument that they had in their hands and their ability that's constitutionally protected to be able to defend themselves in that situation is absolutely abhorrent to me. We cannot accept this idea that we can completely delegate the responsibility to defend ourselves or our families or our country to the government. Yes, the government has a role to play through the military, through law enforcement, but ultimately each of us not only have a right but a responsibility to be able to defend ourselves. And a firearm lets a weaker person be able to do that against a stronger attacker. And I'm never going to leave them vulnerable because some politician feels better if you're disarmed. So that's why we fight about this. That's why we emphasize so much the importance of your Second Amendment rights, because it is so key to preserving liberty. And history has demonstrated it time and time again. And so, yes, I'm going to be relentless on it, just like I am with all of your essential civil liberties. So thank you again for joining us. Make sure that you tune in. Next Monday, we're going to have another podcast coming out. We've got another exciting guest that we're going to be able to share some interesting stories going on with COVID and other issues. Again, thank you for taking the time, and we'll see you next time.